I had a neighbor reach out to me and ask me if I could look at their lawnmower, and of course I said absolutely. Now I did ask them what the problem was, expecting an answer like it wouldn't start or that it runs bad, but I wasn't expecting a specific problem, which is what they told me. I then asked them how they figured that out, and I was quite surprised by what they told me. And since they already knew what the problem was, the hard part now is trying to fix it. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Craftsman branded lawnmower, and the problem is that according to my neighbor, it won't start because there's no spark. Now I don't mind people who do their own diagnostics, but even if I believe them, I'm still going to check it for myself. Now I did ask them how they check for spark and it seemed believable, but of course we'll have to see if we get the same results. Now I'm going to try and repair this lawnmower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you like in the video, please ask about it and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now before we continue with the repairs, I'm going to document all the stickers that I can find. That way, if we need to order any new parts, we'll have the information we need to get the right ones. I'm also going to check both the fuel tank and the oil level to see what we're working with. So luckily we do have fuel in the tank, but we'll have to drain it to see if it's any good or not. It also appears that we have fairly new oil in the engine because there's hardly any color to it. And after wiping the dipstick clean, we'll then install it into the engine to get an accurate reading. But because the oil is quite new, it's really tough to see the level. However, we are over the full mark, which is not ideal. Now, I'm not going to worry about it just yet, and we'll take care of that later on. I also want to inspect the blade for any damage along with the condition of the mowing deck. And it turns out the front portion of the deck is packed with about an inch of dirt and grass. Now luckily the blade is in much better condition with only a couple of tiny marks on the cutting edge. Now to make sure the mower cuts well, we need to get rid of all this packed grass and dirt. Now doing this will also help to keep the mowing deck from rusting out, which could happen after several seasons if it's left like this. So unfortunately, because of the season, sunlight is in short supply in the morning and in the evenings, which is when I like to film. So to save time, I'm going to use my pressure washer, which will make quick work of all that packed dirt. Otherwise, if I use my typical method with my scraper and the low power sprayer, it could take twice as long. So after priming the carb, the engine did not start, which is not very assuring and confirms their diagnosis of a possible no spark condition. But instead of using my spark checker, I'm just going to prime the engine with fuel and see if it tries to start then. Well, that's a bit surprising. If you hadn't guessed, since it started and ran for a second, it means we do have spark. Now I did ask them how they check for spark, and they told me they took the spark plug out, connected the wire to it, and had it touching the engine while pulling it over. Well, that's how I would have done it too, but obviously something went wrong with their testing, which gave them a bad result. I'm not going to blame them too much because I was going to check their findings regardless, but I do applaud them for at least trying. Now, I'm also going to give this mower a quick rinsing, and if you noticed, I didn't bother using my degreaser this time. So the reason why is because I already had the pressure washer out for cleaning the underside of the mowing deck. And out of convenience, I'm just going to continue using it instead of my other method. Like I said, time is not on my side, and you're going to witness that here again shortly. Now normally I would let this sit in the sun for a couple of hours, but to save time and sunlight, I ended up using my leaf blower to speed up the process. Now in real time it took about 5 minutes with the blower, which is a lot better than 4 to 5 hours. So we know we have spark, and since the engine started and ran, we also know we have compression from the engine. So it's either the fuel in the system or the carb itself, but after looking at the fuel, it looks pretty good aside from being a couple of months old. Now you can still use gasoline that's several months old, but it won't have the same punch that it would have if it was fresh from the gas station. That means the next place we need to look at is the carb and see if the main fuel jet might be clogged. Now you can try and remove only the carb from the system, but on this particular one, it's a lot quicker to take off the carb with the fuel tank. Now there is one thing that you'll need to keep an eye on, and that is the O-ring and its retainer. They should be located on the backside of the carb, but sometimes they'll be left behind on the intake pipe. And if that does happen, you'll need to take them off the pipe and reinstall them, which we'll do later on once we get done with the carb. Now before we open the carb, I would like to drain out all the fuel that was inside the bowl. That way we can see if there was any water inside the bowl that was keeping the engine from starting. And after removing the drain with my Allen wrench, I'll capture what comes out, and what we see is nothing but fuel and no water. That means more than likely the reason why this engine is not starting is related to a clogged fuel jet, which is keeping fuel from making it to the engine. That means we'll need to carefully take off the bowl to get to the fuel jet. This would also be a great time to install the drain, that way we don't lose it by misplacing it. So here's where things can get a little bit tricky. You can decide to take everything apart and clean it, or you can clean only the parts that you think need it. Now this carb is in fantastic condition, and I believe the only part that needs any kind of attention is the main fuel jet. And to make it just a bit easier to film, I'm going to pop out the cartridge from the carb. So here's the main fuel jet, and at first glance it doesn't look to be clogged. And you're alright in thinking that, but believe it or not, it's starting to close up, and that's almost as bad as being completely clogged. Now to fix this issue, I'm going to use my carb cleaning wires to clear the buildup in the jet. Now it might be tough to see any difference, so I'm going to put the images side by side so you can see the difference a little bit better. Now I do want to make one thing clear though, I did not make the opening in the jet any bigger, I only returned the opening back to where it's supposed to be. Now even though I don't think it needs it, I went ahead and split the cartridge to see if the openings in the emulsion tube needed to be cleared as well. But it too was in great condition, so I'm just going to close it back up and start putting the carb back together again. But if your carb is in rough condition, then you're going to need to clean it with carb cleaner and make sure all the openings are cleared as well. Now I do apologize for not doing a full teardown and cleaning, especially for those that might need it. But in this case, it simply wasn't needed. Also, if your carb is much worse than this one, you might want to consider just ordering a brand new carb instead. Now this work is not difficult, however, some may not want to deal with this kind of detailed work. Now that the carb is put back together, we'll need to reinstall the O-ring and its retainer, starting with the O-ring followed by the white plastic retainer. After that, we can then install the carb and the fuel tank back onto the engine. Now when installing the carb to the intake pipe, try not to push it completely onto it. Instead, push it most of the way in, but then install the fuel tank and the air filter base, which will then set the carb to its correct location. The reason why is because, just like you saw when we took off the carb, pulling the carb away from the engine could release the O-ring. And if that happens, the engine might not start or run the way it's supposed to. And doing the way that I showed you helps to keep that from happening. Now we are not going to start the engine just yet, and the reason why is because I want to check the valve clearances first. And it looks like it's a good thing we did, because it turns out when they put the spark plug back in, they didn't tighten it. Now the reason I take the spark plug out is because it makes rotating the engine a lot easier for the sake of filming. So if I wasn't filming, I probably wouldn't bother doing it unless I wanted to inspect the spark plug, which is always a good idea. The first thing that we want to do is to rotate the engine so that one rocker arm is all the way down while the other one is loose. Then I'll put a 5/1000 of an inch feeler gauge into the clearance and see how it fits. And what I find is that the feeler is much too loose in the clearance, meaning it's a lot bigger than 5/1000 of an inch. So next I'm going to go up to the 10/1000 feeler and see how it fits, and turns out it's much too tight. That means the clearance is somewhere between 5 and 10/1000, and after a bit of trial and error, turns out the clearance is 8/1000 of an inch. Next we'll rotate the engine so that the other rocker arm is the loose one and check its clearance. And we're going to do the exact same process here as we did on the first rocker arm. But this time it turns out the clearance is not loose but a lot tighter than 5/1000 of an inch. So in the end, I'm going to adjust both the clearances to be 5/1000 of an inch. And to make the adjustments, I'm going to slide the 5/1000 feeler gauge into the clearance and turn the adjusting nut until the feeler almost gets stuck. I'll then rotate the engine one last time and do the same for the other rocker arm. I know I didn't go into why these clearances are important, and instead, all I want you to know is this. If the clearances are too tight or too loose, it'll cause the engine to run poorly and might make the engine tough to start when it's hot or even cold. So if your lawnmower is several years old and you've done everything you could to make it start when it's hot but haven't had any success, then you might want to check the valve clearances because there's a good chance they're out of tolerance. So yes, this is a brand new spark plug that they installed thinking that it might help them with their spark problem. But before I install it, I do want to check and make sure that the gap is where I want it to be at 25/1000 of an inch. If the gap is too big or too small, then this could cause the engine to have starting and running problems. This might be the part most consumers have a problem with, which is all the details you have to remember, otherwise you're going to have problems. I'm also going to give them a mostly new and more importantly oiled air filter since this one didn't come with one. If you don't pre-oil these foam air filters, fine particles of dirt will make its way through the filter and into the engine. This will cause the engine to wear out faster and eventually cause it to burn oil as well. Now to prove that the old gasoline we took out of the fuel tank is still good, I'm going to pour it back into it. After adding the fuel, we'll then watch for fuel leaks from the carb, and if there are none, we'll prime it and then try starting the engine. Now if you do see fuel leaking from the carb, do not try and start it, and you'll have to go back through the carb one more time. So as you just saw, it started up and ran pretty well. But the bigger question is, how is it going to start back up after running for a couple of minutes? And as you just saw, it started back up with a hot engine without any real problems. Now I had no doubts that even with the valves slightly out of adjustment, that would not have had any problems starting. But with them reset to where we have them at, it's going to guarantee that it's going to stay that way for several more years of use. So I did end up balancing and sharpening the blade as well as lubricating the wheels. I just decided to do them off camera as they weren't as important as getting it running again. Now hopefully they'll be able to use this mower a couple of times before the official end of the mowing season. But then it's going to be up to them on how they store it for winter, because if they do it wrong, we'll be seeing it again here in a couple of months. And if I had to guess, I'm pretty sure we're going to be doing the very same repair pretty soon, but then again, I guess that's job security. So my question is, would you do what these people did and try and fix the machine first before handing it off to someone else? No problem if you do, because I know I would do the exact same thing as well. Thank you for watching, and I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.